Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talking Deals with David. This one is an exciting one. I think we've been posting about some of these trade compliance issues over the past couple of days, and I've received a lot of DMs and other questions that we'll try to touch on today. But I think it's a really timely and important topic for really anyone who's looking at doing an M&A deal in 2023 and really as we go along. I think what you'll find is that none of the principles or concepts are really new, but there's just a completely different enforcement environment and geopolitical risks that we'll talk about. So I will of course, welcome any comments. You can type those in very easily and they'll pop up and we'll try to address those. And of course, if you have questions or comments after the live session, feel free to reach out to any of us and we'll be happy to address them. I've got a terrific group today to talk about these issues, about trade compliance and sanctions, import-export issues. And we're going to try to tie it all together, not so much in a technical sense, but more how do these really important topical areas relate to the deals that you're looking at or that you're doing. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is it applies so broadly these days that whether you're a seller who's trying to prepare your company for what you hope will be a fairly smooth and uneventful sale process, or whether you're a buyer. And it's not just cross-border deals. It can be purely domestic transactions, given how much import and export regulations and laws come into play, even in what seems like a purely U.S. deal. So I'm not going to do too much more by way of introduction, but I'm joined by Brent Carlson, who I posted about. And Brent, you're a real global expert on trade compliance issues and have kind of seen everything from, when this was early on, even before that with the Foreign Corrupt Trade Practices Act, all the way through. And so we'll talk a bit about, your experiences and what you're seeing. And then also I'm joined by my partner in our Washington, D.C. office, Stephen Hill. And Stephen and I have worked on innumerable transactions, domestic, cross-border, all kinds of things. And in a lot of those have run into these, very issues, some of which have really threatened to move a deal sideways or potentially even kill it. But often there are interesting and creative ways to kind of get through some of these impasses. So we'll talk a bit about that. But anyway, Stephen, maybe give a brief intro if you have other things you'd like to just highlight before we get going.
No, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. And I'm as David mentioned, I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office and one of the co-leaders of our international trade practice and focus, in export control, sanctions, import-export matters, a lot of cross-border diligence. And just thinking about, this call, I'm now, I think, 25 years in the legal profession, practicing in this area and just thinking about the development of cross-border compliance. When I started out, the penalty statute under which the government can assert penalties for violations of export control and sanctions laws provided for penalties of $11,000 per violation, which is kind of chump change compared to what it is now. Now it's the penalty was increased. This is primarily after 9/11, also where you had increased FCPA enforcement. Increased white-collar enforcement. The government thought we need to get more serious on compliance in the trade area, raised the penalty amount to $250,000 or twice the value of the transaction, so a very significant increase. And then the penalty amount has been going up, adjusted for inflation since then, and it stands right now at around $330,000 per violation. or twice the value of the transaction in question. So it's become a much more significant issue, and it's also tied in to national security issues. The government kind of looks upon these laws are very complex. It's a patchwork of compliance issues, especially since 2014 when the first sanctions on Russia were imposed. And the government, instead of having kind of a comprehensive embargo against countries, now has a more targeted sanctions approach where it's a mix of export control restrictions, various sanctions type restrictions that are not comprehensive, but they'll go after certain specific transaction parties, specific types of transactions like debt related transactions, equity related transactions, and it really puts on the backs of companies and their compliance professionals the need to be cognizant of these rules, and that flows into everything within within corporate operations. So everything from day-to-day operations to M&A issues, where you're looking at buying a company and ensuring that you're not acquiring risk or acquiring other issues that are going to be a problem after buying the company. So it definitely is a very active area. Our practice is it's just been a kind of a continual drumbeat of work all around, helping companies from everything from M&A to integrating afterwards. So it's a very active area, and we're expecting it to be even more active as we go on.
All right. Well, thanks, Stephen. So, Brent, what have you been up to all around the world? I know you have done kind of started in FCPA and a lot of focus on China and Asia, but give me a little background on sort of your take on this and what you've been thinking about in this import-export sanctions area.
Two thoughts. Number one is we've seen this movie before with the FCPA, and looking forward, we ain't seen nothing yet. So I remember starting my career and pulling out this regulation that came out it was passed in 1977. It was the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It took over 20 years for that to really take off. But then I saw it impact deals. I was involved in due diligence and post-closing assessments and remediation, and I could see those actually. The FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, if it wasn't that risk wasn't properly navigated, that could tank a deal. Now, as the world changes, as risks change, so do risk management changes as well. And so we're in a world now where the message is given already by the U.S. Department of Justice in referring to sanctions and export controls. This is the new FCPA. So when we're looking at potential risk in deals and the impact on finance and operations for companies, it's sanctions and export controls. FCPA is not going away, but this is the new priority, and this is something that needs to be addressed and mitigated. Because let's just be honest, there are a lot of places where it just didn't see a lot of light of day, and so now enforcement, the priority on the U.S. government is this, driven by national security issues. And watch as the new Congress comes in January, the push politically that's going to propel this. Again, politics drive regulation, drive enforcement, drive impact on companies. And that's something to sort of think about for the big picture.
Yeah, well, I mean, from the M&A side, let me just kind of paint the picture that I see, and I don't know, people that are watching who do M&A deals. This was an area, I mean, I try to, focus on all the core things when you're doing a deal. For people who follow, my postings, it's not enough as an M&A lawyer, at least in my mind, to sort of just, punt things to specialists, as great as Stephen, you are, and others, because you have to really be able to understand the dynamics that are going on in the deal and where the risks are. If you're going to run the deal, if you're going to work with your client, kind of proactively as opposed to being, very reactive. And this is an area where, you'd see the representations in an agreement that Stephen would do. And you just are sometimes overwhelmed. It's a very complicated area. Stephen, I think you said it's an interrelated web of things that from FCPA to import, export, different government agencies, different interpretations, cross-border implications. It's very confusing, and sometimes your reaction can almost be, I just can't, deal with this. I have to, I hope it'll just go away. I hope it won't be a problem. And on some things that you're doing in a deal, you might be able to skate by with that kind of an attitude. Some of the areas that you focus on, and particularly from the U.S. side, that have real significant value destruction kind of things are things like environmental, products liability claims, underfunded pension, asbestos. These are all areas that not only impose significant contingent risks when you're doing a deal, but that can have some successor liability ramifications. And by that, I mean a buyer being responsible for something that happened pre-closing that it may not have been aware of or had anything to do with. So from an M&A lawyer's perspective, that's the worst situation you can find yourself in. You don't want to bump into a liability after closing that you had no idea was out there, you didn't assess, you didn't factor into the valuation, you didn't provide any specific indemnities for. It's really a nightmare. The liabilities I mentioned, I kind of like better in the sense that you can usually ring fence those to some degree. And there are pretty good actuarial valuation, other kinds of models where you can assess a little bit, what are we talking about in terms of magnitude and how do we address these in an agreement? The thing that scares me about this, and Brent, you're always, scaring me about this, but the thing that really scares me about it is it's hard to get a feel of how do you get insight and transparency into this, because it's quite hard and challenging to diligence in today's compressed time frame. And also, when you identify things, it's quite difficult to get a sense of what the ramifications are, which makes it more difficult from a negotiating standpoint, to wrap your arms around it and try to get a resolution. So those things, to me, as an M&A lawyer, are converging along with, Brent, what you described, these kind of shifting political trends, national security trend. It's leading to this kind of perfect storm of things that I do predict, along with both of you, I think, that when deals are going sideways or when you're finding real significant liabilities after closing, this may be one of the main areas, if not the main areas, that we're going to have to tackle. So, Stephen, on your side, do you agree with that sort of characterization, I guess, as the first thing? And then what are you thinking about and doing in terms of helping either sellers when they're thinking about a sale process, but more importantly, I think buyers trying to figure out, how do I get out of this mess of stuff and do sort of targeted diligence that will ferret out, these kind of risks and then try to deal with it? I mean, how are you thinking through those issues in the M&A context?
Yeah, so well, first, it's important that companies be thinking about this issue, from the get-go, because you have to structure your diligence to make sure that it's kind of meaningful and that you're using the proper questions, you're asking the proper questions, you're focusing them on the areas where they're important. Ensuring that you're doing that, and just talking about the FCPA and some other of these areas, there's a lot of overlap in the diligence, and it's important that there is coordination. In fact, I've got FCPA colleagues here in the firm, in which we've been involved in your deals as well, and there's significant overlap when you're looking at transaction parties, you're looking at intermediaries, you're trying to look at owners, direct and indirect owners of transaction parties to see. For the FCPA, you're looking for government connections. In the sanctions area, you're looking for anybody who has some kind of a designated party or some other sanctions designation that's going to create a problem. So important to get in there early and make sure that the diligence is properly structured and that you have the questions out there. You're getting information relatively efficiently. And then you understand if you're buying a company that has, potential sanctions and export control compliance risk. Are they doing business in parts of the world where there's a lot of risk, or is their business primarily focused in the United States and other close allies of ours that also have their own robust sanctions and export control compliance regime? And so you can probably tune down a little bit I shouldn't say tune it down, but at least focus the diligence on what needs to be focused on. And from the seller side, you want to be able to anticipate the questions that you're going to get from qualified counsel on the other side. So you're going to want to be looking at these areas. You might be dealing with a company in the export control context. Maybe you're dealing with a company that really has not looked at the classifications, export control classifications of products, software and technology that they're developing, because that's going to be one of the questions coming out from the other side. Maybe you need to do a little bit of analysis, maybe get some classification rulings from the government to confirm that products that are being exported haven't done so properly, because they're not under an export control provision that would require a license to where they're going to. So a lot of that is anticipation and just ensuring that you have proper information lined up for buyers when they start looking at these issues.
Brent, what are you seeing? I mean, I think you were mentioning to me that sort of diligencing counterparties, really digging deep into some of these areas is something you're seeing people missing. But what do you think in terms of big gaps or areas where people in M&A deals, whether it's lawyers or even sophisticated people, private equity sellers, buyers, who do a lot of deals, this seems to be an area that I don't know whether it's just the complexity of it, the fact that there's so many different moving parts, but I just get a feeling a lot of times it just sort of zones out. It's not, it doesn't get the same excitement level, I guess, as a super fund liability or some significant product liability. That seems to catch people's attention. But how do you get a similar feeling with clients that you work with?
Yeah, I actually had a friend of mine once accused me of selling FUD, F-U-D, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I said, hey man, I am just the messenger here. The fear, uncertainty, and doubt already exists. What we do is provide simple and elegant solutions to get around it, or to address it. And the issue is that when you talk about magnitude of importance, look at the geopolitical world we live in today. So already news broke that US-made components are being found in Iranian drones used by Russia and Ukraine. Recently made components, right? And on existing sanctions in Iran that have been there for a long time. These are not just reputational, but operational and financial landmines that quickly can turn into time bombs. That said, we need to take a look at where those risks are and how to address it. What I've seen is that in looking at companies and in the let's say in the M&A deal cycle or helping companies with their compliance programs, there's two main issues that come up. One is just nuts and bolts. Does the target company have a compliance program? Do they follow it? Is it based on U.S. Department of Justice, BIS, OFAC, DDTC guidance? That's just that's one simple check mark. The other, that's nuts and bolts. The second one is weak links. How are the inputs going into that system? And where I've seen now is that where the really weak links are in the know your customer, know your business partner diligence. Because people say, well, we got a screening software and there are a million different tools out there. But be careful, because those tools can break down. I've seen it where, especially in the bulk upload functions, they'll miss they'll miss relevant business partners that you need to catch and diligence first. Now, again, the whole thing doesn't mean you can't do business with them, but you've got to document that you did your diligence, you did your screening, you did your evaluation, you ran it by counsel, and then you can proceed. But I think at the end of the day, it does seem complex, but there are certain sort of choke points or bottlenecks that you can address that can get you where you need to go in this new geopolitical world.
Is that one example you gave, Brent? Was that sort of where the U.S. manufactured components were found in drones in Iran? Was that a dual use sort of an issue? Were those properly exported someplace and for another purpose and then repurposed? Is that what that issue was about?
The whole issue now, in looking at this, is why this is such an important issue. Yes, there it comes down to dual use technology and components. In the past, you had the coming out of the Cold War, there was a strong export regime on military technologies. Now, the future, the current, not even just the future, the current, what we're seeing on the battlefield is really built around dual use technologies. Another example, graphic chips used were designed for computer games, but they also have excellent applications for artificial intelligence, which is driving all sort of military technologies these days. That's part of that tectonic shift out there. So it really comes down to it's dual use technologies, and then watching how those dual use technologies and components get out into the market globally.
Stephen, how do you assess those sorts of risk where you have companies that are manufacturing items that they're putting into the stream of commerce for a particular one, but then ending up someplace else, and is that a significant liability risk not only for that company, but again presumably for a buyer who might be coming on and maybe inheriting these liabilities down the road?
Yeah, it's a significant liability, and under the Export Administration Regulations, which is the primary U.S. export control regime for commercial and dual-use goods, it prohibits not only a direct export in violation of U.S. law, but there's this thing called General Provision 10, which prohibits you being involved knowingly in a transaction regarding an item that has been or is or will be involved in a violation of the EAR. And knowledge is interpreted quite broadly to include not only direct knowledge, but also, should you have known of this liability just based upon the paperwork in the transaction. And you have had cases of companies getting into serious trouble, because there's something within the paperwork kind of indicating that there may be some restricted use of the product down the line, maybe by nature of the party involved or, other indication of where it's going to go. And so we, for example, have looked at cases where a company is selling to a distributor in Canada, and they think that their compliance obligation is done there, but then it turns out the distributor is selling their product to Iran or to other countries, to Cuba, which is subject to a very broad embargo. The same thing with sales to like the UAE. There's a significant trading zone and port there that is a significant potential transshipment point for goods going into Iran. The same thing with exports to Asia that might subsequently go to China. So it is a big issue, and the new FCPA comment that the Department of Justice mentioned, that was primarily in the area of sanctions, but I think definitely export control is also in that area, and we're going to be seeing much more export control compliance issues, especially with some of the recent rules that have been imposed on China, where now we have restrictions on pretty comprehensive restrictions on merely the use of technology that is of U.S. origin or equipment that is the direct product of certain U.S. technology and software that's being used to produce semiconductors, supercomputers that are going to China, and so I think we're going to have a lot more of export control liability to look at, in addition to the sanctions liability, which has been real and very significant.
What is that on the new FCPA? I think I get it, but Brent, I know that's sort of. I wouldn't be surprised if you have that tattooed somewhere, because I just have a feeling that's sort of like your thing. But I want to make sure I understand what that is. What I think it means is that it's not that these are new, because a lot of these statutes have been around for a while. I know there's changes periodically and different enforcement priorities, but I think what they're getting at and what you're getting at is the FCPA was almost a sleeper in some respects. I think you kind of hinted on that. I think when I started practicing, which would probably be about 20 years or so after it was passed, I think it was used very limited before that, as I recall. But then it sort of, became much more, much pervasive, and you saw it in deals and other places. But are they getting at the idea that that's the new enforcement priority, that's where the U.S. government is going to now be placing its enforcement tools and remedies, or is there something else they mean when they say that, this is the new FCPA?
That's exactly it. It's enforcement priorities, and it goes back to I tell folks too. I don't make this up. I just shovel it. So it's the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco came out middle of this year, and she started saying that sanctions and export controls is the new FCPA. And I think for folks that have been operating, some of us, we have a few gray hairs, but not many, but have been around and we've seen this. We saw how the original Foreign Corrupt Practices Act became such a core part in deals and the whole white collar world. When the DOJ makes a statement like this, saying this is the new FCPA, we got to take that seriously. And then you look at, okay, what are the political drivers behind it? And it is a perfect storm. And also this is going to be this type of stuff too is one of the last bipartisan issues in Washington D.C. So I tell folks just get in front of it. And the one thing, just building on Stephen's points on the diversion risks, those are key. It's not just selling directly to some of these locations, these geographies, the countries and entities on a particular list. It's everywhere in between, and the bad actors know that. So they will try to set something up where you're going through third countries to get to that final destination. And I had one project. I looked at the trail ended at a comedy club in Cyprus for a dual use item. No joke. So I think that's I don't think they really need this item for their business, but that's the type of thing that you're going to have to be looking for, and that's what the government's going to hold us all accountable for.
Yeah, and I guess, again, from the M&A side of things, the scary thing about this, not only these sort of, stories that you and Stephen are telling, which are, scary enough, but to me, the normal tools that an M&A lawyer would have, isolating the liabilities in a subsidiary entity, for example, using an asset purchase structure, as opposed to just buying the stock of, let's say, a seller that's engaged in importing and exporting and where there may be some risks. Those are pretty typical strategies. I've been looking at some, I think, more innovative approaches by using corporate divisions that are authorized in some states to kind of try to isolate risk. But at the end of the day, what I think I've been trying to get across from sort of the corporate side, none of those strategies, which is what makes this even more scary, I think, are guaranteed to work. And in fact, if you look at some of the settled cases that involve traditional asset purchase structures that, the buyer didn't have knowledge. This isn't a case, where the buyer was sort of in collusion with the seller or anything like that. They didn't know. They may, I think in a lot of cases, undertook reasonable diligence and didn't discover it. So they weren't able to ferret it out. And they structured as well as you normally would do. They're still tagged with that liability. And what I understand, and it'd be helpful to, confirm my understanding is right, the government takes the position that it can impose this kind of successor liability on a buyer, even if the buyer didn't know, did an investigation, tried to find it, didn't figure it out, and used asset purchase structures or other ones. And a government can come in and does come in and say, we're going to impose liability all the way up the chain if necessary. And we're not going to be concerned about legal structuring niceties or other things that you may have done that might work in other circumstances. Is that a fair, characterization, I guess, of where things either are or where they might likely move in terms of the liability shifting piece of it?
Yeah, and in fact, this goes back to an administrative law judge case about 20 years ago out of BIS, or actually then known as the Bureau of Export Administration, called Sigma Aldrich, where the government, in an enforcement matter under the underlying enforcement statute called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is what the Export Administration regulations and also the OFAC sanctions are enforced under. But applied in a transaction, what's called a substantial continuity test, where they looked at whether employees were the same, products were the same, holding yourself out as a continuation of the business, other factors like that, to say that we're going to disregard the transaction structure and go after you on successor liability principles, for the violations of the entity that you previously purchased. So it definitely there's a precedent for it. It's been applied since then. Typically, you see successor liability in both EAR and OFAC enforcement matters. So it's definitely a concern, and it's difficult to structure your way around it in an acquisition, especially where you're buying either your intention is to buy a business lock, stock, and barrel and incorporate it into your operations. One thing I'll point out, and kind of when you talk about successor liability, you can divide it into tiers, and what we've been talking about here is kind of the first tier, where you're buying a company that itself has been committing violations of export control and sanctions laws. So that company, even if it's never acquired, can itself be penalized for violations. But there are additional issues on what you might consider successor liability that you really can't structure your way around. And these are issues that are going to arise merely by acquiring the company. One of which is you may acquire a company that has foreign affiliates that are engaged in transactions with embargoed countries like Iran and Cuba. Under the relevant sanctions regimes for those countries, the sanctions restriction extends not only to U.S. persons or U.S. companies, but any entity that is owned or controlled by those companies. So that includes foreign entities that are owned or controlled by them. And so you could buy, let's say, a company in Italy that has substantial operations, substantial sales to Iran, and they're kind of humming along all happy because there's no restriction under EU sanctions laws. Those transactions automatically become prohibited when you acquire ownership or control of that Italian subsidiary. And not only that, to put a finer point on it, the way that the law is structured is that if there's a violation, instead of going after the newly acquired affiliate in Italy, the government can go directly after the U.S. parent for penalties that's specifically written into the Iranian sanctions regulations. One other area where you may have an issue is where you have like block property. And again, you may have a foreign entity that is happily engaged in business with certain parties that are sanctioned under U.S. law. But then once those contracts are acquired, they can't be performed because they're prohibited for a U.S. person either to perform or provide facilitation or some other support to the performance of it. And so you basically have acquired an asset which you may have valued fairly highly in the deal, which basically can't be monetized because you're no longer able to perform it because it's a block property requirement. Not only that, but once you have the block property, you have an affirmative obligation to report the receipt of the block property to OFAC. So you've kind of not only bought an asset that you can't perform, but you bought a compliance issue that you have to go to the government to report now. So those areas you can't really structure a diligence around them because they're issues that arise merely by acquiring the business rather than acquiring a business that prior has been engaged already in violations of U.S. law.
Brent, is so I guess from this, what I'm seeing is, are you recommending to clients of yours then you just sort of really front load all of this in terms of, especially from the buy side, but I keep drilling on the sell side too, because in my mind, when I represent a seller, I want as clean of a sale process, as quick of a sale process. I hate getting a call that the buyer has come up with something, that we're not aware of. That's just not a good, place to be. But are you kind of suggesting then you really front load this and, and bring in, folks like yourself and Stephen really early on in the process to try to, get your arms around this? And then I want to talk briefly about then what the heck do you do about it? Once, if you don't identify things we've already seen, you may have problems and you may be stuck with those. And in today's world where you have very limited post-closing remedies, we'll see how that shifts as the economy sort of, moves, whether that swings a little more buyer favorable. But for now, you're still seeing very seller favorable, no recourse type deals. So, Brett, what are you suggesting in terms of trying to get your arms around this in a sale process?
Absolutely, it's all about getting on top of this before a landmine becomes a ticking time bomb. And I helped companies too. I mean, this is obviously this conversation is a no-brainer on the buy side, but also on the sell side, it's also an issue of getting the companies ready for sale. And I've seen this movie before. I helped private equity firms get their portfolio companies up to speed with Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, anti-corruption compliance programs. This wave is coming and it's more intense.
Stephen, what are you seeing in terms of once you identify issues, let's say on the buy side, how do you sort of think about those? So let's say there is some, significant compliance gap that you've identified. Let's say there's no sanctions or, economic implications right now, but you're viewing something that, perhaps was done incorrectly, perhaps has sort of an embedded liability. How do you think about that from the buy side in terms of approaching sellers with that, or thinking about ways to mitigate or resolve that when you're doing a deal?
Yeah. So if you're maybe the answer depends upon whether you're acquiring a U.S. or a non-U.S. entity. If you're acquiring a U.S. entity, they're already fully subject to, they're U.S. persons, so they're fully subject to sanctions, compliance requirements. If they've been exporting, they're fully subject to the export administration regulations. Hopefully you can get a sense of any potential violations or perhaps categories of transactions that you want to look at further. Again, let's say that they haven't been doing a good job in determining the classifications of their products, and you're wondering if there are any products that have been exported, in violation of U.S. law. And we see this a lot, like in software, like companies don't do a good job determining if they have encryption in their software, and if they do, what's the level of encryption control, and do you fall within a particular license exception for certain exports? But if you can get down to a kind of a category or even a countable number of transactions, there's a way, again, because we're dealing with a penalty statute that has a specific number within it, or a number that's determinable, you might be able to get your arms around that and get a number, and perhaps get a holdback and an escrow, maybe get a deal, reduction in the deal value. If you're not able to do that, but you think that there are a lot of compliance issues in the company, then, again, maybe that's just a matter of going back at them and saying, we think that there's going to be cleanup, and getting some kind of a reduction in the deal value. What's important there is that, and this is the thing that we frequently see, is that companies do a really great job, or some companies do a great job in diligencing a potential acquisition, and they don't do a particularly good job in cleaning it up after they acquire the company. It's very important that if you've identified things in diligence, or if you've kind of identified smoking issues that need to be looked at more, that those are actually cleaned up and looked at post-closing. And companies have been penalized very heavily for acquiring companies where they identified issues and they really didn't do anything about it. That's where you see the penalties that really
I see. So that's like a no, because then at that point it's an integration sort of issue, right? And it's a no, and then it's really yours.
At that point. Yeah.
Yeah, it's at that point so it's now your responsibility. So I think that's another great point in terms of mixing the integration aspect with the diligence. Hopefully those teams are, aligned and have some sharing of that information, because I think that's right. Because then at that point you're the responsible party, and if you continue to further, those compliance gaps, then you're not going to be very well received if you have to report something that came out of that in the past. What about you, Brent? Anything that you're seeing in terms of how these issues might get resolved in an actual sort of negotiating process if you find them? If you're doing your job well and then you identify things, how do you see that kind of playing out?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are issues that need to be just incorporated into the value of the deal, and reflected in it. And so the best thing is to make sure that's done up front. I've also been in situations post closing where we've had post closing arbitration on disputes where, look, this wasn't the company we bought. This is what's this these are, you got all these different issues in there, and so that's another avenue for recovery if it goes down that road. But what I also seen is, like, a lot of times too, is that there's some of the hidden risks here that also, it's not just the company on hook. The government's going after individuals. And you look at where the trend is, where it's going with the U.S. Department of Justice, they're targeting individuals, and they're now looking at CEOs and chief compliance officers certifying, like the SOX 302 certification, but certifying the effectiveness of their compliance programs. Think about that. I mean, that's going to put a lot of people on the hook. So that's one area to also that's been emerging as well. The other thing is, like, there are also hidden areas where you say, okay, well, we don't do any business in, obviously we don't do in Iran, or we're not selling to Russia, or we're not going to, or certain parts of the sectors for China. But also there are a lot of hidden minefields where you may not think that there are issues, but there are. And one is the issue of deemed exports. Research, development, and engineering can occur entirely in the United States. But if that's a controlled technology and a license wasn't applied for it, and you had people originally from these, professionals from these jurisdictions involved in it, that's a potential violation as well. So again, it's like it goes back to the theme: the world has changed, risks have changed, our risk management strategies need to evolve as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, the way I've been thinking about it is, when you're valuing a deal, whether it's an EBITDA multiple kind of formula or something else, sometimes you'll take adjustments for deferred CapEx or other kinds of things where, the seller, let's say, has sort of artificially inflated, earnings by deferring certain expenses or other things. Buyers, especially in today's market, can sometimes use that effectively to get, kind of an adjustment to the headline price. This, to me, strikes me as something very similar. If they've been operating with kind of a artificially, reduced expense, budget, which inflates your earnings as a result of not implementing appropriate compliance, then why should those costs be borne by the buyer after closing? And so finding a way to do that might be one warning that I just want to kind of send out to people that, again, do what I do, M&A deals. Don't think that your rep and warranty insurance policy, which you see a lot in deals these days, whether it's an asset deal or a stock deal, will magically cover, solve your problem. Or, which is even worse, people who say, I'm not going to worry about that, I've got a rep on that, which is a terrible way to view the purpose of reps and warranties. But you'll still hear that sometimes. We don't need to look at that, we have a rep about it. Well, that is not a good strategy. For one, we've got these very significant successor liability issues we've talked about. But the other is, the remedies against sellers these days are very limited after closing, even for a rep breach, taking out, fraudulent behavior or something really extreme. And although the rep and warranty policies that I've been seeing do generally cover these sorts of trade compliance, import, export type matters, assuming they've been adequately diligenced, the insurers are not going to cover it if you've just, thrown up your arms and say, we have a rep. They're going to want you to dig in and have people like Stephen, on these calls telling them what they did, what they looked at. But there will be coverage, but that coverage is usually limited, not only by the retention, but also by relatively low dollar caps that you're seeing in deals. And more importantly, there's tons of exclusions in these policies for things like fines, penalties, sanctions. It may well be that the biggest risk that you're trying to get, even if arguably the rep itself is covered, might not be covered when you actually dig through your policy. So thinking through those issues and trying to address them, as we've been talking about, in sort of a proactive as opposed to a reactive way, even if it means a temporary bobble in your deal, it may set things back. And Stephen, you and I have worked on another way to do it is sometimes you make closing conditions that are keyed off of making voluntary disclosures or getting the right, export licenses in place, or otherwise cleaning up things, getting a resolution with the government. It could be a million different creative ways to do it. But trying to address these things in a proactive way is going to be a lot better than getting that terrible call after the closing that says, oh, we missed some big issue. And by the way, we really don't have much by way of indemnity or recourse against the seller. That can really destroy, Brent, as you've said, value. I talk about value maximizing. That's a real value destroyer. And in deals that are still high, deals where valuations are still high, they're still kind of sticky on the high side. You don't have much margin, in today's world when you're a buyer. You don't want to lose millions of dollars or potentially more significant things, losing your export licenses, having government sanctions against you because you missed something. So I guess let me just kind of end with a closing. Stephen, any final thoughts that you want to kind of end with on kind of the theme of this and what people should think about as they're doing M&A deals?
Yeah, so I think in M&A deals, looking at not only actual violations by the company that you're acquiring, but also thinking about and again, this probably be more of an issue for acquiring a foreign company operations, but thinking about what the operations would look like, once you own them. And whether there are any contracts, whether there are any transactions, that you can continue to engage in, or that the company you've acquired can continue to engage in as a company now owned by a U.S. business. And again, it could be a legal bar. It could be a reputational bar. Like you may have a situation where you acquire a company that has operations with certain parties. That although are subject to U.S. sanctions, it would still be permissible for the foreign company, if it's still separately organized under laws of its own jurisdiction, to continue to do business in. Is it worth it to continue to have the company still involved in that, because there might be reputational issues? We didn't really get into secondary sanctions, which is another area of potential risk that's pretty difficult to diligence. So I think my takeaway would be just ensuring that the diligence is robust. It's full. It covers all of the potential issues. So it looks at transaction parties. It looks at other parties they're involved in to see if they have any sanctioned person connection that would be some kind of a risk. Looking at all the jurisdictions that they're involved in. And also make sure that the time range is proper, because we're talking about for direct violations, we're talking about a 5-year statute of limitations. And sometimes you get into diligence and the sellers don't want to give you information going back more than 1 year or 2 years, or they don't want to give a rep going back sufficiently far. And again, this is kind of a risk weighing issue where if maybe you can accept a shorter look back period from a company that isn't as big of a risk, but maybe you want to go for the full 5 years, do the full 5-year look back. Just again, making sure that the diligence is properly scoped and that it's being looked at and you're kind of on top of the issue as early as possible.
Thanks, Stephen. That's awesome. Okay, Brent, what's your kind of key takeaways, based on what you're seeing and thinking about and that people should focus on as they're planning their deals for 2023?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to just keep in mind the world has changed. Risk management, risk issues have changed, and risk management strategies need to change as well. And the geopolitical trends out there are not going away. They're only going to be intensifying over this decade. So just get in front of that. And it doesn't mean you don't have to be scared, don't have to, run away from deals, but make sure it's adequately reflected in the deal value, because this is it's the new FCPA, as the U.S. Department of Justice has said. So we can't overemphasize the magnitude of that sort of statement. So it gives you a sense of where things are going and where the risks are today.
Thanks, Brent. Well, thanks to both of you. Now I know what the new FCPA reference means, and I think, at least for me, it's given me new ideas and things to think about on deals. So, and I promised everybody who's listening that it was not going to be boring. And I hope, but people can, write us or let me know if I was right. But I think this is a very interesting area, actually. It has a lot of, interesting dynamics in terms of how negotiations play out, how you can use some creativity and drafting and thinking about, these issues. So for me, it's really great to have, two true experts who've really been in this, for many, many years and have so many great insights. So I appreciate, Stephen, of course, you joining and also helping me on navigate these things on our deals. And Brent, it's terrific to have met you, I think, on LinkedIn. Somehow, I think following each other's, content on LinkedIn, but it was absolutely terrific to meet you and be willing to do this and talking and giving us your expertise and insights. I really appreciate that, and everyone for joining. Thanks very much. And if you're watching, after the live broadcast, please send Stephen or Brent or me comments. Let us know what you liked or didn't like, and if there are areas that we can help with, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Be well.